Hello, Fiveable. Welcome to our live review today. Today's going to be a little bit more hands-on than usual. So if you're watching live at home, I'm going to need you, yes, you, to help us participate and get the good practice that we need for today's live review on annotating secondary sources. So before we get started, I just want to introduce myself, and if you could also introduce yourself in comments. Let me know also if you are a teacher or a student, because today's lesson is going to be equally beneficial if you're a teacher and if you're a student. Obviously, if you're a student, these are some skills that you're going to be learning and practicing throughout the course. But if you're a teacher and you're here to kind of get some new ideas or some new information about how to teach this topic and this skill to your class, absolutely will be beneficial for you as well. So a little bit about me before we begin. My name is Allie Thiessen. I am coming to you live from Germany. And you may be watching this wherever you are around the world. I'm so glad that you're here joining with me today. Today's review, like I said, is going to be a little bit more hands-on. So I'm going to be kind of relying on the comments for you to get that good practice. If you're a little comment shy, that's absolutely fine. Some of these things, when we're doing secondary sources, they may be a little bit longer. And so they do take a little bit of processing time. So I'm going to try throughout this lesson when we do the practice to give a lot more processing time. And so you may see it just kind of like me just sitting in the corner down here. I'm just trying to give a lot of processing time to work with the documents because all people work at different paces, especially different reading abilities. And especially with it being so early in the school year, this is going to be a good skill and a good topic just to introduce and to kind of get our feet wet a little bit. But it's going to be something that is a continuous practice, and getting better at it is going to take a lot of work because you as students and you as teachers are going to be working with a lot of different documents in different formats. And trying to understand those documents and working with the documents is one of the most base level skills that can be built on to use for in your multiple choice questions, in short answer questions, long essay, and of course, document-based questions. So as historians, we work with documents a lot. My experience, I am a teacher. I taught for 8 years in Nebraska. I'm currently here in Germany. But one thing that I always do with my students is we work with a lot of primary documents. That's one of the things that most students and teachers are going to be accessing. And there is a great Fiveable review that Caroline did a little while back on annotating primary sources. So if you have that account to go back and watch on a later date, that would be another great resource for you guys. So today our topic is on annotating secondary sources. It sounds so exciting, doesn't it, to do this after a long day of work, especially you teachers that are in here now, probably finishing up your day. And I'm so happy that you're here joining with me. I know teaching is exhausting, especially so much in the beginning of the school year. All right, so let's kind of jump into it with a little bit of introductory practice. So if you are a student, this is going to be something that may not be totally on your radar yet, especially if you just started school, if you're one of those schools that went back after Labor Day and you just started. So I'm going to show you guys two sources. They're divided by that little blue, that Fiveable blue line. So they're two different sources, and they're obviously also about two different topics. So we're going to be looking just briefly at both of these sources. Is my face in the way down here? All right, let me read them so we can make sure we can see them. So the first one at the top says, source, Martha Glaser, Louis XIV, and the Heir Presumptuous, Mankind, the Magazine of Popular History, 1967. The bottom document says Antonio Vasquez de Espinosa, Spanish priest, Compendium and Description of the West Indies, 1620s. So we haven't even looked at what the documents are actually saying yet. And so even without looking at these documents, let's just kind of look at the sources. So the first one, the topic of the source, is Louis XIV. Well, if we know anything about history, was Louis XIV a king in 1967? And you can answer in comments. You can answer in your head too. No, Louis XIV was not king in 1967. But let's look at the bottom source and let's look at the timing. Antonio Vasquez de Espinosa, Spanish priest, West Indies, 1620s. Well, were the Spaniards in the West Indies by the 1620s? Yeah. So just looking at the sources without even having to read in the documents at all, can we guess which one of these is the primary source? Is it the top document or the bottom document? Answer in comments which one of these two documents is a primary source. Is it the top or is it the bottom one? Answer in comments. It is actually the top document. The top source, or sorry, the primary source is the bottom document. Absolutely right, Will. The bottom document is the primary source. A primary source is written at the time of the event. And so at the time of the event, 1620s, we have Antonio Vasquez de Espinosa. He's seeing it from a primary or first-hand account. So then what would be the secondary source? It would be the top document. As we said before, this article is about Louis XIV and it was written in 1967. Well, Louis XIV was not alive in 1967. So it is a secondary source. Oops, I think I lost my screen. Hold on one second. Are we back? There we go. Sorry about that. Don't know what happened. So we have our primary and secondary source. And now that we've seen both of these, and we didn't even read either of these documents, and guess what? We don't have to. What we can just look from the sourcing is a quick identification about what is the source. If it's a primary source, we know it's written as a first-hand account. It's probably going to be from a historical source that saw the event firsthand. Sometimes they can be, like hearsay, but we're generally seeing somebody who witnessed the event firsthand. Whereas in a secondary source, it's written after the time of the event. A lot of times when we see historians that write articles or write books, they're usually secondary sources, meaning that they are looking back at history and they're kind of making conclusions and drawing different arguments from history. So we generally can tend to say, like, looking back, it's 2020 because you can see things in a more direct line. Whereas if it's right at the event, you may have some bias that overshadows how you witness that event. So in working with primary and secondary sources, most of the time in the AP histories, what we're going to be working with mostly is primary sources for things like document-based questions. But we are also going to have to work with a lot of secondary sources. And we have to be able to identify secondary sources, annotate them, and also do a little bit of sourcing and working with these documents in the same way that we do with primary sources. So there's a lot of similarities between working with primary and secondary sources. But there's also going to be some differences that we're going to address today. So good job identifying those primary and secondary sources, even though I had a Freudian slip, of course. The bottom one is the primary source written at the time of the event, and the top one there was the secondary source. So Before we jump in too far, just to give an upcoming look at what's going to be happening elsewhere in the AP World History of Fiveable. We have a ton of great live streams coming up. Now that we're kind of getting into content, some of these are going to be really, really great resources to kind of place ourselves in history. Our class kind of jumps in randomly at the year 1200. And so these continuities lessons that are coming up are going to be so, so helpful because they're going to kind of give us a little bit more historical context for those topics that we're starting with in class. We also have another kind of skills-based live stream coming up with Melissa on the 12th on doing the short answer question. Now, today in our lesson, obviously, we're going to be working with annotating secondary sources. That's the title of our lesson for today. Before that, I'm just going to go back into those terms. If you're just joining us late or if you don't exactly know what primary, secondary source are, I have a couple of other terms to introduce too. And then we're going to be working with a lot of secondary sources. Again, this is really going to be a lot of practice-based. And so we're going to be doing quite a bit of practice. So I'll be having a lot of lead time, kind of like waiting time for you guys to read and process the documents and to answer either in comments, or you can also answer on your own as practice at home. Also, if you have these slides, which were linked, you can pull these up and go back through them later as well. So we're going to do lots and lots of practice today, and I'm just going to kind of explain how to do this practice, and then these are things that you're going to want to apply in your classrooms. So terms we should know. Primary and secondary source, I kind of hit on a little bit before, but also because our lesson is on annotation and how to annotate secondary sources. If you don't know what annotate is, you're like, why am I here? I don't know what annotate means. And also stimulus-based question is something that you probably have heard as a student, probably have heard of now in your classes, but it may be a term that you feel like you should know at this point, but if you don't, I'm going to introduce that just in case you're too afraid to ask. So primary source, I showed you guys before, it was published or created at the time of the event. So generally, these are going to be firsthand accounts. As well with these firsthand accounts, how to identify them is we're going to get a document and it's going to say source and it's going to give a year. And generally speaking, when we're looking at historical documents and we can look at the year and kind of question, is this plausible that this source existed during this time? So that's what we did when we looked at that first kind of sample is 1620s Spanish priests. Well, were there Spanish priests in the West Indies, 1620s? Is it plausible? Yes, probably a primary source. Whereas in the 1960s, was Louis the 14th alive? No, long dead. So we can kind of nix that as being a primary source. So those kinds of cues, looking into the sources, is going to help you identify what kind of document that you're working with. And then from identifying those documents, how are you then going to work with it? Because secondary sources are written after the time of the event. This could be years after the event, this could be decades after the event, this could be a really long time between these events. Usually when we see secondary sources, they're by historians. So when historians work with documents, what they do is like what we do as AP history students. We're working with primary source documents and then we're making sense of them and we're creating kind of a new source that's analyzing history and making sense of history and making connections of history, but we're not living during the time of the event. So those are all secondary sources. And as we're going to see, secondary sources can be like articles, like text sources, like we just saw that we worked with previously. But secondary sources can also be maps, they can be charts, they can be graphs, and those ones kind of take a different skill set of how to annotate because we don't have all the words that we're working with. We kind of have to read the map or read the chart first, and then work with it. And so there's a little bit more that we have to read into sometimes with secondary sources. But again, today our lesson is going to be on secondary sources. Like I said previously, get on that Fiveable Plus, go back and do the replay watching of Caroline's on the primary source. So what does it mean to annotate? If we're annotating a document, what we're doing is we're working with a document. We're not just sitting back and reading words and not working with them. When we annotate, we do a close read. We pull out information that's important. We summarize information, and then we analyze, and I have a little typo here, it should be a text. So we're looking at different secondary sources today, and what we're going to be doing is we're going to be literally working with those documents. And how I teach this with my students is I tell them write all over the documents, especially when we're getting like a test. On the AP test, guys, you can write on the questions. In fact, you should write on the questions, and you should mark them up, and you should be circling things and underlining and writing in the margins, because that's going to help you go beyond just reading and comprehension. You're going to get to those next steps. You're going to analyze, you're going to synthesize, you're going to go beyond just simple reading comprehension. And that's where AP history really differs from regular history classes. We need to go beyond what we're given, and we need to make sense of the historical content that we're getting. And then stimulus-based question. I threw this one in here because I was talking to a colleague and I said stimulus-based question, and they asked, what is that actually, a stimulus-based question? And you may have heard it in other Fiveable streams. I think I mentioned it before in one of my previous streams, but I just want to throw it out. What that means is a question that relates to some type of text or image or graph. And on the AP history test, you're going to get a ton of stimulus-based questions. Our entire multiple choice test are stimulus-based questions. What that means is you're going to get maybe an excerpt like the ones I showed previously. Maybe you'll get that excerpt about Louis XIV and the heir presumptuous. And then there'll be maybe 3 multiple choice questions that all work with that same stimulus. Or maybe you'll get a graph, and then you'll have a couple of short answer questions and prompts that go with that graph. And so these types of questions is one of the main reasons why we need to be really, really strong at working with different documents, images, and graphs, as well as text. And annotating is going to be so helpful for multiple choice, for short answer questions, for document-based questions, just throughout the entire course. Being able to work with sources is so, so important for AP history. Okay, now that we've gone through some of the terms, again, today we're going to be annotating, working with documents, and we're going to be working specifically with secondary sources. Before I get into the working with and annotating, I just want to do a quick review on how to source documents. There are previous lessons also on Fiveable. I did one. If you're not already sick of my voice, you can go back and watch my video on sourcing. And I taught a method called HIP, which stands for Historical Context, Intended Audience, Purpose, and Point of View. In comments, let me know if you know how to source a document, if you have seen these 4 terms and you know what they are. Because if you don't, I'll spend a little bit more time on here. Sourcing documents is most important for the document-based question because we are analyzing the source who gave us the document. So we're looking at the historical context, what's going on at that time period. I need to look further into the document. We could be looking at the intended audience. Who was this document written for? Same thing with the purpose. What was the point of this document? What's the intended purpose or the goal of the document? And then the point of view, we're looking at kind of the author's point of view, if they have any inherent bias that's going to make us look at their version of history slightly different. Now, when we are doing a sourcing, including a secondary source, it could look a little bit different. So in comments, let me know which of these four do you think would be difficult with doing with a secondary source. Remember, a secondary source is not written at the time of the event. So in comments, which of these four do you think would be really difficult to do with a secondary source? A lot of them are going to be really difficult. Historical context, because it's not written at the time period. So we can't really analyze it so much. We could, it kind of depends on the article. Maybe it's written at a very intense time period that plays into it. Audience, absolutely, Evan, will be really difficult to do because the source is like, me? Is it me? Is it history students? Because if it's like a textbook, well, yeah, you're the audience of that secondary source. But writing to you, it's not really going to change the document a lot. Same thing with the purpose. If it's like a textbook, well, what's the purpose? For students to learn? That's not really what we need to be looking at when we're sourcing documents. These types of things are much, much easier to do with primary sources than they are with secondary sources. Author's point of view as well, unless they have like a really obvious bias. Sometimes you'll get a secondary source that is maybe a name that you know, kind of like one that's important to history or something like that. But a lot of these are going to be really, really difficult with secondary sources. And students do struggle with this on the DBQ, on the document-based essay, because there may be a secondary source on there that's like a graph. But you can't really look at it from the time period that it was written. You kind of have to be looking at it from the historical context of when it's actually looking at. So looking at that document that we saw previously about Louis XIV, we can't really do the historical context on the 60s. We have to kind of go back. It makes it a little bit difficult. It makes it a little bit more confusing. So sourcing the documents is going to kind of be like a next step. Today, we're going to kind of do more of the baseline. We're going to be looking at just working with secondary sources and how we can read them and how we can make sense of them a little bit better. So I have another secondary source example for us. So this one, again, it doesn't say source like we're going to see on a lot of the questions from the AP history test. But this one, the source is obviously going to be at the bottom. And the source here is Thomas Madden, St. Louis University, History of Relations Between the West and Middle East. This was from NPR, All Things Considered, in 2004. Does anybody know this person? Anybody know anything about All Things Considered, 2004, NPR? It's kind of hard to do the sourcing of this one. This one, though, we know for sure is a secondary source. We check the date, 2004. We even just look at the first line. It says the medieval Crusades. Well, the medieval Crusades, not 2004. So we know right away that this is a secondary source. So let's read the document. This one's a little bit shorter. I'll read it for you guys. You can just enjoy the sound of my lovely voice. So this says the medieval Crusades were taken and then turned into something that they never really were in the first place. They were turned into a kind of proto-imperialism, an attempt to bring the fruits of European civilization to the Middle East, when in fact during the Middle Ages, the great sophisticated and wealthy power was the Muslim world. Europe was the third world. This is a very interesting secondary source because this one has a very clear argument. And in this kind of argument, what we're really seeing here is an argument that kind of looks at history in a different light. So if you are here watching with me in comments, what is the argument that Thomas Madden is making? See if you can kind of point out what the main purpose or the argument is of this excerpt. Now, in working with a document like this, here's kind of our first look in how we're going to annotate. If I was a student that got this document the first time, I would be grabbing my pen and I would be underlining what I think is the argument. Because when we're reading documents like this, they're going to have an argument, especially secondary sources. A lot of the times they're going to have some type of argument within there. So I would grab my pen and I would underline what I think is the argument. And what I think is the argument is what I would underline is they were turned into a kind of proto-imperialism. That's really a hard term if you don't know what proto-imperialism is, especially if you haven't learned imperialism yet. Imperialism is like extending your power over another dissimilar peoples. And proto is like a kind of a type of imperialism. And so what we're looking at here, I would underline that as the main argument. I would also underline things that stand out to me. I would underline things like Europe was the third world, or I would underline Middle East, great, sophisticated, and wealthy power. What we're doing with a document like this and what the argument is saying is that it's looking at history from a different perspective, looking back in time and saying, well, the Crusades aren't really everything that meets the eye, because Europe was the third world, which we don't really use that term anymore, but Europe was not as sophisticated, not as advanced, and not as unified as the Middle East was during this same time period. And so it's looking back at history and it's kind of analyzing it and looking at it in a different perspective. And so as historians, as a student, we're going to have to point out and pull out that information from the documents. So I would work with this document by underlining things, and I would be circling things, and then I would be kind of summarizing in either my head or I would write it out as well. So here are the steps that we're going to be doing with our annotating of secondary sources. And I kind of modeled it a little bit before. So the first thing we need to do is identify and annotate the sourcing. So we need to take a look at what the source is. If there is a particular source in a particular method, a particular person who's presenting this information in a different way, that's something that we could look at, and it could stand out because it may have some inherent bias. Maybe it's from a leader of the Muslim world. Maybe it's from somebody that is historically relevant. That's going to be something that's going to take our understanding and point out maybe even a little bit of bias or something that's just going to be extra when we're looking at the documents. So that's the first thing. Now, in a secondary source, you won't always have a sourcing like that with a name and a date. As we're going to see when we see like charts, we're not going to be like, oh, this is the human who made this chart. It'll probably be like the book, and that won't really have a lot for us to work with. In those cases, we're going to be looking at like the titles and things like that. Step 2, when we annotate, is we're going to be marking all over the documents. And that's what I was kind of pointing out with our last source, because I would be underlining things. I would be circling things as well. You want to especially be looking at things that stand out, things that are arguments or they sound like they could be historical claims. And you also want to underline things that would be evidence. And so what I would have underlined in that first one is I would have underlined, as I said before, the line about how it was a type of proto-imperialism, because I think that was really the main argument. And then the other two pieces, Europe was the third world, the Middle East was the region of sophistication. Those are things that would be evidence for me. And then making comments. And what I always tell my students to do is work with your margins, because on the AP test wastes a lot of paper. There's a lot of margin space actually, and you can write in the margins. And I think that that is so, so helpful, because what a problem is that you're going to run into on the AP test is like pacing your time. And especially if you're doing like a document-based question, because you have a 15-minute reading period, and then you want to be starting to write the essay. What you want to avoid is you're in the midst of writing your essay and you can't remember what that document was. So you have to go back and reread the whole document or re-look at a map. If you write in the margins, it's going to be a quick visual help for you so that you don't have to go back and reread things. Same thing with underlining and circling claims and evidence, especially things that stand out. I don't generally encourage people to use really long quotes. But if you're going to use something brief like Europe was the third world and put those in quotes, if I circled that, I would know right away that that is something that I want to use. But one thing that you can always do is use those margins and make comments. And they don't have to be long. In fact, I would encourage you to be as brief as possible. Don't write sentences that, would be essay sentences. Make sure you put those in your real essay. But I would write things in the margins. I would write different comments, and I could write a brief summary. And that's also something that I think is helpful on the DBQ, because you're going to be working with 7 documents, and then you're going to have to kind of put them together into paragraphs. And if you write like brief summaries on the sides, you're going to know what's going to work together. In multiple choice as well, I think it is helpful. A lot of students don't tend to write a ton in their multiple choice question booklet, but I think it's really helpful to do, especially if you have a question that's a really long text, because again, it's about pacing. On the multiple choice for the AP World History test, it's 55 questions in 55 minutes. So your pacing is 1 question a minute, but you have documents, because as I mentioned before, they're stimulus based. So if you circle, underline, and write around those sources and those documents, you can spend less time having to go back and reread them. It's also helpful to help you stay awake. Testing in the morning and testing such a big, long test, I swear to you, if you write and make comments as you're reading the sources, you're going to stay engaged and you're going to stay awake during the test, which is really, really helpful, especially if you stayed up craving the night before watching Fiveable videos. If you write on your documents, it's going to be such a big help for you. So let's practice annotating a next source. If you, I want you to kind of do this in your head. Obviously, if you didn't print out these slides, you won't have them in front of you. Go back and get these slides, make sure that you have them, and practice kind of going through these by writing on them. So I would grab a pen if I had these printed in my head. Now I'm just going to kind of do a visual underlining. So the first step, remember that I said, is we're going to be looking at the source first. So our source line is below. It says this is from John P. McKay. Article was titled The Americas, and this is from a book called A History of World Societies. It doesn't give us a year, but just based on the title, A History of World Societies, pretty clear that this is going to be a secondary source. This one also has a title called Building the Inca Empire. So when we're looking at the sourcing of this, not a lot really stands out about the person. I don't know John McKay, sorry if you know John McKay. I don't know this book or this article at all, so there's not really much I can read into about it. And so it's a little bit harder to do them with a primary source on sourcing those documents. So instead, let's kind of look at the argument and the evidence in the text. So let's read it. And as we're reading it, we're not going to read it 2 times. As we're reading it is where we're going to be doing our mental underline if you're watching this with me live, or if you're doing this back as a replay, underline these, print out those slides. So it says every family had to provide crops for the Inca nobles, bureaucracy, and religious personnel. and also send a person to work a certain number of days per year at other tasks. These included providing military service, building and maintaining palaces, temples, roads, and irrigation systems, terracing and irrigating new arable land, acting as runners on the post roads, weaving and dyeing cotton cloth, and excavating imperial gold, silver, and copper mines. This labor tax, called the mita, was rotated among households throughout the year. So, main argument. If you're here in comments, which lines or what do you think stands out as being the main argument? Here, I think the main argument is that first sentence. And so this is demonstrating that every person within the Inca Empire would be doing some type of labor for the empire. And then the things that stand out, of course, are going to be, yep, good job. First, the things that stand out that back that up is the evidence. So the evidence generally are things that I would be looking at and seeing if anything stands out in particular to me. So I could circle or I could underline these things, and I could have those kind of be a visual cue for me as I go back and look at the evidence. So here it just provides lots and lots of examples of ways that people in the Inca Empire have to serve their empire. And one thing big that stands out for me is the term mita. If you haven't gotten to this point in history yet, this is going to be something that is important in understanding how labor systems worked in the Inca Empire. And then later when you get into like how the Spaniards kind of built upon that mita system using forced labor in the regions that the Incas ruled, those are things that would be connections. So we can make some types of connections just based on things that we know. Even other things like runners on the post roads. Maybe you have learned about the Incas and you understand their complex systems of roads that were used to communicate and connect their vast empire. So these are things that I would underline or circle because they stand out to me. Then you can also write in margins. So when we have something this big, the first sentence obviously is going to be kind of the argument, but it's not so much a claim or an argument. It's just saying that they did certain things, certain tasks. So I could kind of write in the margins, I would write labor as tax for the empire. All families must do. And I would kind of write that so I'm a little bit of a summary. So I could go back if I was doing other questions and I could make sure that I understand what that source was and what the main point was. So for this one, we are going to, that's obviously with a text, and we've worked with text a few times now. So the next one we're going to do is work with a map. Maps and graphs, charts are also secondary sources, and these ones aren't as obvious to work with because when we're annotating a source like this, it's a little bit more difficult because we don't have those kinds of standout words that are there with us. Plus, it requires a second step of comprehension. We can't just like read the words and know what they mean. We have to read the map correctly. And that's something that I know my students struggle with, especially when it comes to like multiple choice questions, is they will completely misread a chart, and then they're going to miss the next 3 multiple choice questions. So for this one, again, our first step is we're going to be looking at the source. So this is Elizabeth Gaynor Ellis and Anthony Esler, World History, Connections to Today, Prentice Hall. Anybody using that book? Anybody? That's an interesting one. So this, obviously, we don't really have a main point, but what do we do have? A title. So the title would be the main point. You could annotate the title. Does anybody know who Zheng He is at this point in history? Anybody get there that fast? If you don't know who Zheng He is, you will. So I would know who Zheng He is by the end of the school year, and then I would write something on that. So I could make connections, I could write things and annotate in this way. I would maybe write above this with like a little arrow after Zheng He's name. I would write Ming Dynasty, exploration of Indian Ocean. So I would kind of already know and make connections, kind of make my own little argument. So in this one, we don't have the words to rely on. All we have is this tiny little key, and all it says is exploration routes. So these are the voyages of Zheng He. I know that he was sent by the Ming Emperor, which is Chinese. So in this map, I do think it's hard if you don't know Zheng He, because it's really hard to find the starting point. Anybody else agree with that? It's kind of hard to find the starting point on this map. I know that he came from China, so I can kind of trace the voyages a little bit easier that way, because I can start at China and kind of see where he's going. So this one, we see that he is leaving China, and you can see the dates there. He's going through Southeast Asia, up through South Asia, into the Persian Gulf, and into the Red Sea along the east coast of Africa. This one obviously doesn't have like a main point. So what I would do is I would summarize it on my own. So if you're here in comments, or you can do this in your brain as well, what would you say the main point is for this document? What do you think the main point is? Yes, good point, Evan. If you don't know where the origin is, to look at the dates. I am looking at a teeny tiny screen, so I know that this is a little bit harder for me. I can't really even see the dates on here. Yes, that's another good way. If you don't know where Zheng He originates, look at those earliest dates, because that's going to be his origin point. Absolutely good point. So if this was a text and it was saying in words, Zheng He left the Ming Empire, went through Southeast Asia, South Asia, Persian Gulf, the east coast of Africa, those would kind of be our evidence. So the map and the points on the map of the exploration with those routes would be like our evidence. So we would kind of think of a main point of this. The voyages of Zheng He went throughout the Indian Ocean, establishing contacts through various peoples across the Indian Ocean, and then using those as our evidence. Again, working with a map is going to take a little bit of a different skill, because we have to be kind of relying more on our visual cues than just our reading comprehension. And because here, there's really not a lot to read. And another important thing here is context. And so when we're looking at a secondary source like this, unfortunately, we don't have a lot of sourcing to work with here. Instead, we need to look at the context of the time period. So we know that it's starting here in 1405, I think is the earliest date of point there. And then you can see that the dates go through a couple of decades. And then if you know anything about the Ming Empire, or if you know anything about why the Ming ended the voyages of Zheng He, that's how we can imbibe, and that's how we're analyzing these documents. We're taking content knowledge and we're connecting them to these documents that we have. Let's do another non-text secondary source, a graph. This graph here, it actually does take a little bit to kind of read through, because it just looks like a cog, you know, all these kinds of things coming off it. It's actually just a timeline, but there's really no title here. So we need to kind of look at what this document is showing us. This graph, we look at where the big words are. It's on the far left. It says invented in China, received in the West. So how we actually look at this is everything above the timeline is when they were invented in China. So everything above the timeline is China. Everything below the timeline is the West. So we're looking at Western Europe in particular, even as far as like Southwest Asia. So when we're looking at a graph like this, it really doesn't have a title. So if I was looking at this graph, I would make a title. And so in comments, what do you think you would call this? What do you think the title of this graph would be? Now, when we're kind of creating a title, we're really creating like a main point of the graph. We're kind of making an argument about this. It's looking at Chinese innovations, and then it's looking at when they came to the West. And so what we can draw from this document is that these inventions originated in China and then were spread to Europe, to the West. And these obviously are going to be things that are going to really impact history and impact the West and how the West interacts with other areas, like the compass, gunpowder. Obviously, especially when we get into the timeline of history that we're starting with in the new modern course, those inventions being used by Western Europeans are going to extend their empires across the seas. But if we look at this, we can see that the compass actually originated in China. We can see that explosives also originated in China, and then they spread to Europe. They spread to the West. So that's another thing. We can be looking at this, even though we're not giving a lot of words to work with, using our context and using our content history and those things that we've learned from history, we can also provide the evidence. Well, good job, Lucia. You said spread of Chinese innovations. Well, then we can kind of look at that. How did they spread? When would they have spread? And we can look again at, the Silk Roads, maybe be some of our evidence, some of our examples. Obviously, that's not even in this graph. This is how we're working with the secondary source and how we would annotate it. So I'd grab my pen again. I would make a new title. I'll go with that one, Spread of Chinese Innovations. And then I would be maybe circling ones that are similar. I'd be looking at movable type, maybe I'd circle, or the oldest book printed, and then block printing. So I'd be looking at the printing press. That obviously is going to have a huge social impact on the West. And using those kinds of context clues are going to help you make more sense. So we would know kind of during this time period, if you're starting at like 1200, we know about the Mongols. So I'd be writing in the margins, I'd be writing this kind of dead space, I'd be writing the Mongols. I would be writing the Silk Roads, and I would be reading into it more. When you're annotating a graph like this, you can kind of think of it as like talking yourself through it. And that's one thing I have to do with these. I have to kind of talk myself through, especially when it's one that's not so obvious, like this graph with the things above invented in China and received in the West, because they're kind of smushed together for me. I would have to kind of walk my way through it. And that's a great way, obviously, to use contextualization. And by making sense of it in this way and having additional visual cues, you're going to be able to rely on your knowledge of history in addition to just what you're given. That's really our goal for AP History, is working with the documents. Absolutely, Evan, this is going to be something you may see in a DBQ, and I can tell it would be hard to work with in a DBQ because we have to take it beyond face value. And you're absolutely right. We need to use contextualization. We're given these time periods here, and we see that they're spreading. We have to know what's kind of going on in the world at that time in China and in the West and between them. So I like that one. I think that one's a good one. All right, are we ready to get some real good practice? Because I'm going to give us some stimulus-based questions now, working with secondary sources. So let's go over again those three kinds of steps that I was talking about. The first one is looking at the source. Is there anything obvious about the source that would change how we're viewing the document? Second, we're going to be writing on the document. We're going to be underlining and circling things. And the third thing is we could be writing in the margins. We could be making summaries, and we could be writing things that stand out on a graph. Maybe we're writing a title or writing some context. And so those are really kind of our three steps. So obviously, again, if you're doing this just at home live and you don't have anything to kind of write on, do it in your head, write it in your head like I am. It looks ridiculous, but I swear it works. All right, so first thing, this is the same document that we looked at originally. So now we're actually going to read it. So this is, again, the same one, the first one that we saw, Martha Glaser, Louis XIV, and the Heir Presumptuous, from Mankind, the magazine of popular history in 1967. So the title of the article is Louis XIV and the Heir Presumptuous. Does anybody in here know what presumptuous means? In comments, see if you know what presumptuous means. That's a Google word, man. That's a, can I ask Alexa or ask Siri? So presumptuous can mean like arrogant. It could mean presumptuous comes from presume. So we're kind of looking at like a pompous, highbrow. I'm giving a lot of other words that are really stuck up, arrogant, those kinds of words. So I think that one's kind of a fun title. So let's look at the document. Obviously, 1967, we can't really figure out too much about that. So let's look at the source itself. Grab our writing utensil, and we are going to, in our head, kind of underline and highlight, circle things that stand out to us. I'll read it for you guys so that you guys can just kind of go through it with your pretend marking. As early as the 1660s, the harassment of the Huguenots, Protestants began. It worsened until by the 1680s, members of the pretendedly reformed religion, as they were contemptuously or scornfully called, were threatened with the loss of their children, forced to quarter disorderly troops in their homes, and excluded from the professions and all public offices. The persecution seemed to produce the desired result. On October 17, 1685, Louis revoked the Edict of Nantes with the explanation that toleration was no longer needed since Protestantism had ceased to exist. The aftermath of the revocation was disastrous for France. Many of those who abjured or gave up their Protestant religion repented of their weakness. They were unable to either return to their old faith or become genuine Catholics. Several 100,000 Huguenots chose to escape to Holland, England, and Prussia. France was deprived of their considerable talents and energy, and her enemies were enriched thereby. Other thousands of Huguenots, their flights unsuccessful, were sentenced to the galleys, where many quickly died from beatings, starvation, and overwork. Yet almost unanimously, Louis's contemporaries, those have power at the time, considered the revocation of the Edict of Nantes an admirable deed. It would take misfortunes in which they themselves were the sufferers to change their minds about the beneficence of the Sun King. Yeah, so let's go over the steps again. This is a big document. And if you tuned out, it's because we weren't annotating, or you just hate my voice, which is fine too. But again, when we are reading a big document like this, we should be marking it up. So the first step is we look at the source. So the source line here doesn't really give us a ton. If we know what presumptuous means, or if it's a title that kind of stands out, maybe it's a historian that we know something about, that we can kind of mark up like we would for a primary source. We can be looking at their point of view if we know anything about it, or their purpose if it's anything different. But this one is an article in a magazine. And so here we don't really have a ton to identify with the source, but we do know obviously from 1967, it's a secondary source. So the next step is, as we're reading, we are annotating. So we are marking it up. We're working with the document. So how I would annotate this, because it is a little bit longer, don't underline everything because everything can't stand out to you. Really, we want to be pointing out the main points of this. So the main points here was really that the aftermath of the revocation of the Edict of Nantes was disastrous for France. So that's something that I would underline, because that is a claim. It's saying this was bad for France. And then it's going to give us some reasons why. And so that is kind of the main points that we should be pointing out and underlining that can draw our attention. Then the third step is kind of a step beyond. We're going to be writing in the margins. So we can summarize these types of things. So end of toleration of Protestants. We can be writing in about the religious conflicts in France between Protestants and Catholics. And I could just be kind of writing little bits of summaries in the margins so that I don't have to go back and reread it. But guess what? This practice actually goes with a multiple choice question. And so I hid the question because a lot of times people don't work with the document enough when it's a multiple choice question. So I wanted to show you can still work with the documents, even if it's a multiple choice questions. You can still annotate the same way, even if it's a multiple choice question. So let's look at the multiple choice question here. The author's view of the economic consequences of Louis XIV's actions in the second paragraph most directly reflects the influence of which of the following? So in comments, sorry if we're going to mention that, in comments, answer what you think is the correct response. The author's view of the economic consequences of Louis XIV's actions in the second paragraph most directly reflects the influence of which of the following? So let's go back. If we were underlining these things, what would be the economic consequences? They fled France. Though they were hard workers, they went to other countries, and that was a loss to the French economy. So A, B, C, or D, what do you think is the answer here? Nobody wants to guess? This is kind of a hard one. The answer here is D. Yes, it's D. This one's kind of a hard one because if you guys haven't got to this point in history, you're like, what the heck is mercantile policies, mercantilism? If you haven't gotten there in history, it is a little bit more of a difficult one. But I wanted to point out using this question because it's saying in the second paragraph. And so it's going to point out some things, but here's the deal. If you didn't annotate, guess what you're going to be doing? Reading the whole second paragraph again. And so you want to avoid that. So if you annotate and you're kind of underlining these things and circling these and kind of making comments, you don't have to go back and reread the document a second time. So I'm trying to save you a little bit of time there. Another option that sometimes people teach is to read the question first and then go back and read the document with those questions in mind. That is a little bit trickier because usually there's like 3 multiple choice questions with one document, and you don't want to take too much time going back and reading the question, looking for the answer, reading the question, looking for the answer, reading the question, looking for the answer, because that could almost take triple the amount of time. So I did this one, even if you don't know a lot of history, somebody got it right, woot, but still you can annotate a source in multiple choice. All right, that was a hard one. Thank you for working with that one. Let's do another one. This is a map. This is 2 maps, actually. And so the first map says South America 1790, and the second one says South America 1828. Here's another one that doesn't really have a great title. It just says South America. Cool. Like, I know that's South America, hopefully. So again, our first step, we can look at the source. This is from Brief Review in Global History and Geography, Apprentice Hall book. Okay, not so much to work with there. Obviously, it's a map, so we know it's a secondary source. But how I would start this is I would look at one source at a time. So let's first look at South America in 1790. We have a little bit of a key there, and it says possessions. And then it has British, Dutch, and French, Spanish, Portuguese. And you can see that in this, obviously, most of South America is controlled by Europeans. There's very few areas that are left untouched by European possessions. Just that small area unexplored there to the south. But then we look at the second one, South America 1828. Here we can see the possessions of the British, Dutch, and the French are just those dark shaded areas. And then the light shaded areas are independent. So in this one, how you would mark it up is, for this one, we'd probably be writing in the margins a lot more. So what are some examples in comments? What are some examples that you would write in the comments? Like, what would you write on the sides of these documents? This one is pretty similar to working with that graph because we do need a little bit of historical context for this. But very obviously, I could write a little title for the first one and say that Europeans conquered and ruled most of South America. Or I could write the Spanish controlled most of Western South America, while the Portuguese dominated Brazil, and there were smaller British, Dutch, and French possessions. I could also use a little bit of context. Why were they there? What were they doing there? Plantations, mining. I would write those kinds of things in the margin. Then I would look at the second one. Well, obviously, yeah, there's definitely going to be more borders. You can see just how the territories' names have changed. Well, we have new states. And not only that, they are independent states. So absolutely, using our context, we know that these are going to be after the South American revolutions. The South American revolutions removed those European possessions from most of South America, and they became independent states. And so those are things I would write. I would write borders changed. I would write revolutions if I know something about them. And writing those things in the margins for this is how you would more easily annotate them. So this is another question. It's not a multiple choice. This is actually a short answer question, because remember, we could be seeing secondary sources in some of our short answer questions as well. So this one says, identify and explain one political difference between South America in 1790 and South America in 1828. So if you wrote those things in the margins, this would be pretty easy to do. You could explain that after the era of revolutions, South America's territories went from European colonies to independent states. Very easy to do if you annotate it, right? All right, y'all, we're almost out of time. So we're going to do one more, which is actually the last one I planned. And this one is another multiple choice question. So I will actually show the question here first if you want to try that tactic about reading the question first and then reading the source a little bit longer. So let's try it. According to the passage, why did trading with intermediaries make more sense than traveling to the source of a product? So we have that in our head. We know that we're kind of looking for intermediaries, and we have kind of an argument we're looking for. Why did it make more sense? So now let's read the source. The source, again, we look at, this is from a book, The World That Trade Created. Again, we know it's a secondary source. That title kind of gives us something that it's going to be focused on trade. So our question is about trading with intermediaries. So I'd have my pen out and I'd be looking for those things. Nature also shaped the rhythms of trade and the places where it was conducted by constraining or hindering transportation. All across maritime Asia, from Canton to Mecca, trading schedules, or that's Mecca, right, were dictated by the monsoon winds. Since strong winds blew consistently in one direction for several months and then stopped, and then blew consistently the other way for months, it made no sense to fight those winds. A trader went as far as he, or occasionally she, could in one direction and then stayed around until the wind reversed. His goods were then picked up by another merchant who had arrived earlier and knew precisely how long into the next season he could safely stay and still have enough days of favorable wind to get home. Thus, instead of Chinese traders spending 2 or more monsoon seasons and years sailing all the way to, say, Persia with the silks, it made more sense to sail out one monsoon season and exchange with intermediaries, clue there, based in between, and thereby return home with frankincense and rugs. A series of emporia or trade centers developed at sites such as Malacca. Siri thought I was talking to them. Syrah and Muscat, that had more to do with how far one could travel from there in one sailing season than with what goods could be produced locally. The result was a remarkably lively and cosmopolitan chain of port cities along the Asian littoral. But in many cases, these cities had only weak relationships with their immediate hinterlands. So we already saw it. We even used the word intermediaries. So now let's look at the options. Why did it make more sense to use intermediaries? Was it A, the monsoon winds allowed merchants to better plan their travels? B, frankincense and silk were extremely valuable? C, it allowed merchants to get the same products with a shorter journey? Or D, China's distance from its trade partners made travel to places like Arabia impossible? So A, B, C, or D? Good. Yep, it is C. Good work, guys. All right, so again, for this one, we could be writing all over it. Obviously, we would probably be having about 3 multiple choice questions with this. So we would need to kind of write in things because chances are the other 2 multiple choice questions won't be about intermediaries. So I would be underlining things, I would be circling things, and of course, writing in those margins. Don't forget that we need to work with documents, especially with texts that are really long, that give us almost too much words, and then when we're looking at maps and graphs that don't give us enough words. All right, let's kind of get to the end here, y'all. Good job today. Here are some kind of takeaways, some reminders for you. I remember that you want to practice how you would on the AP exam. This is one sticking point that I always tell my students. I don't let them use highlighters or multicolored pens or sticky notes when they're annotating because they can't do that on the AP exam. On the AP exam, you're only going to be having your blue or dark blue or black ink pens, or multiple choice, you only have your pencils. And so you want to practice how you're going to do it on the AP exam. So I wouldn't even practice with highlighters, even if you really, really love highlighters, as I do. And remember that annotations and skills are useful in all content areas. If you are in science classes use charts and graphs all of the time. And using these annotation skills, kind of reading more into just the information you're given, is going to be a skill that's useful in that science class when you're working with things like graphs. It's also really useful in English classes. And it's useful when you go to take the SAT and the ACT, working with those kinds of sources on like reading sections. Being able to annotate, not just in history, is a skill that you're going to use for life. Being able to kind of engage with your information and making more sense about that information is going to be so helpful for you. And then the other thing is you want to practice a lot. I know it seems really time consuming, but working with these documents and annotating, it may be long and may take you a while to do at first, but the more you do it, the quicker you'll be. And if you start now, which those of you who are watching live and you're starting now, good on you, because you're going to get so much better at it and you're going to get quicker, and it's going to be kind of like second nature. You're just going to be getting a document and you're going to start marking it up right away and engaging with the text and making sense of it. And so practicing is going to just give you easier practice later. So, my friends, thank you all so much for joining with me today. And I hope you learned a little bit about annotation, working with secondary sources. I'm so glad that I had you in here with me tonight. Don't forget to follow us on our social media platforms at Fiveable. You can follow me on Twitter. Ask me any questions if you have any follow-ups on Twitter at Mrs. Thiessen. Again, this is Allie Thiessen coming at you from Fiveable. I'm so glad to have you here tonight, and I wish you good luck in your future. See you guys next time.